our own laws given to us by the Creator, which through our oral traditions instruct us to live in a spiritual manner with all living things. Our original self-determination is the right of our nations to exist free from all patterns of colonization and domination, which are cloaked by states in the euphemistic language of good governance and reconciliation. This NAIPC intervention highlights our recommendations, numbers 11 to 28, extracted from the full NAIPC report, which can be found on the UN Permanent Forum Indigenous Issues website as Conference Room Paper 2. Agenda 3, special theme, self-determination, principles of good governance consistent with the UNDRIP, Articles 3, 6, 46. There was discussion around concerns related to the use of territorial integrity in Article 46 of the UN Declaration. One elder spoke to the refusal of member states of the United Nations to recognize our nations as nations. He considered it necessary for the member states to recognize our nations. He also discussed Article 4 of the Declaration and its focus on autonomy, a word used by states to mean internal self-determination. He noted that this is far short of political independence. None of the articles of the UN Declaration appears to cover the right of political independence. Every nation on Turtle Island has lived with natural law. He noted it is the member states that are the violators and reminded everyone we're human beings. Number 12, the right of self-determination, this broadest of all human rights, legitimizes other rights we fought so hard for, and we must vigilantly defend it. The right of self-determination is precisely what drove Indigenous peoples and nations to seek out the international fora in the first place, to have the right of self-determination applied to us as peoples. We did this in the hopes that international law could and would help our nations and communities retain or regain control of the homelands that shaped our distinctive identities. We are now affirming our right of self-determination as clearly expressed in international law. Another Indigenous representative noted that the concept of territorial integrity is one of the fundamental reasons why the United States and Canada oppose our original rights. When we talk about states, we're talking about the very people who have been working to steal the land from us. The states have a backwards way of talking about Indigenous people's rights. There is also the concept of radical title, which is also called Crown land. What is commonly called the territorial integrity of Canada is otherwise known as Crown land. What the states are saying is that anything that disrupts what the states considers to be its territorial integrity is considered to be disallowed. It was also noted that the idea of territorial integrity of the state traces back to the symbolic acts of possession, premised on the doctrine of Christian discovery and the supposed discovery of the lands of non-Christians, the religious basis of which is not dealt with in Ed John's advanced, unedited version report, a study on the impacts of the doctrine of discovery on Indigenous peoples, including mechanisms, processes, and instruments of redress with reference to the Declaration, and particularly to Articles 26, 28, 32, and 40. NAIPC reminds that the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues conduct an expert study of the historic and contemporary domination and dehumanization of Indigenous peoples, placing a particular focus on the uses of Christianity, dehumanizing terminology, example pagan, heathen, infidel, barbarians, and savages, to deny the independence of the original nations of Turtle Island and other parts of the world. The NAIPC recommend to the members of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that any further discussion on self-determination take into consideration previous and existing work already being done in other UN bodies. Recently, the independent expert to the UN Human Rights Council, Alfred Desayas, released a report of the independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order at the General Assembly that should be taken up and supported widely. NAIPC calls upon the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to set the theme of the right to water for the 2016 session, or in the alternative 2018, that specifically initiates a close review and assessment of water allocation, contamination, use, regulation, and access policies that affect the rights of indigenous peoples and nations, the health of our communities and ecosystems, and that of our future generations. Reaffirming water is crucial for biological, cultural diversity and for sustaining all aspects of indigenous peoples' full expression of our self-determination, and essential for our physical, cultural, and spiritual well-being. State governments are not recognizing the economic rights of indigenous peoples who practice trade of goods and services across borders. The NAIPC recommends to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to reinvigorate the study done on cross-border issues and direct the UN to implement its findings. The NAIPC calls on the state governments in negotiation with affected indigenous peoples to rescind domestic laws and policies that restrict or impede the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination, including but not limited to land claims and self-government policies. That NAIPC recommends that the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues conduct a study of state governments' efforts to convert indigenous peoples' land rights, title, and tenure into non-indigenous property systems. That NAIPC recommends that the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues facilitate a comprehensive dialogue with the Human Rights Committee on the application of Article 1 and comment of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to indigenous peoples and its implementation to indigenous peoples by state parties. The NAIPC is gravely concerned with the increasing criminalization of indigenous peoples by labeling them as terrorists or anarchists. This criminalization is enacted against indigenous peoples who are exercising their right of self-determination and who are acting in defense of their rights. The NAIPC recommends that the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues call for a study to examine the scope and identify remedies that protect indigenous peoples' right to freely exercise their right to defend their peoples and lands. The NAIPC recommends that the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues address the violations of the right of self-determination and full and equal participation as peoples, equal to all other peoples in the conceptualization, the design, the implementation, and evaluation of regional trade agreements among the UN member states, such as are evidenced in North America by the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the impending menace of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. With regard to the increased militarism and militarization and its destructive impacts and how this affects indigenous people's capacity to
Madam, we're on to about 10 minutes now in your presentation. You start winding down, please.
Yes. With regard to the increased militarism and militarization and its destructive impacts and how this affects indigenous people's capacity to decolonize and to assert self-determination, the NAIPC calls to direct state parties, a part of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to respect and enact Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Covenant and to enact a half-day discussion on the UNDRIP, Article 3, with regard to militarism and militarization. NAIPC endorses the American Indian Law Alliance's statement on territorial integrity, addressing the United Nations declarations on the rights of indigenous peoples, specifically Article 46. It reviews territorial integrity and the right to self-determination, applying the 1970 Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the 1993 Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. NAIPC notes that Article 46 cannot serve as a caveat to the UNDRIP. The provisions set forth in the UNDRIP, Article 46, 1 and 2, must be interpreted in the entirety of the UNDRIP. Article 46, 1 and 2 must be interpreted in accordance with the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and good faith. Indigenous nations and peoples' right to our own territorial integrity needs to be taken into consideration. NAIPC recommends the adoption of the report of the expert seminar on treaties for assertion and enforcement and the designation of an appropriate UN body as a registry for Indigenous treaties. NAIPC recommends that an accurate and appropriate nation-to-nation fiscal relationship be established with Indigenous nations in accordance with the UNDRIP Article 19. Finally, NAIPC calls on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues to participate in enabling and operationalizing the UNDRIP Article 41 and to conduct a UN study on the Indigenous rule of law in accordance with the UNDRIP Article 27. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.